Thank you very much for being in Ukraine, for coming to teach here and speaking to people and posing questions.
Well, it's me that has to thank you because you gave me the opportunity to come here. You set things up so I could have these conversations with you and with your students, with politicians, journalists, and students. You know, I wanted to have these conversations to understand what this existential moment is creating for Ukraine as a people. So I've learned so much, and I really owe you. But this is a front line against fascism and a front line for democracy. I'm an anti-fascist, and I'm an anti-imperialist, and I work on colonialism. These are topics I work on, and it's an existential moment for Ukraine. And we know with the Russians, we know what they did in Syria. They killed 48,000 civilians in Aleppo. You know, they've been practicing for this, the Second Chechen War. You know, the Russian army, Putin has been practicing genocide now for a long time. What's happening in Russia is it's a long-standing imperialist country, and those brutal practices, like the Chechen wars of the 1990s, are coming home. And so, you know, Russia itself faces, you know, opposition figures in Russia face terrible treatment from Russia. So Russia's a fascist country, and it gets its population used to fascism by sending them out to commit horrible crimes in other countries.
But the Soviet Union didn't do that?
Soviet Union did, but the Soviet Union did.
What's the distinction then between the two?
Because the Soviet Union hid its fascism under a cloak of social justice. So just like the United States hid its brutal treatment of black people under the cloak of democracy. So the United States now has the world's largest prison system. So 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States. So both the Soviet Union and the United States hid brutality, Soviet Union more so, hid brutality behind these cloaks of social justice. And so Russia's not pretending anymore at all. Yeah. So, and the pretense turns out to be important because the pretense stops you from doing the worst things.
The worst things.
Exactly.
Yeah, there are some limits on that.
There's some limits on that.
And they don't have the limits
There's
anymore.
no more limits. So in the first instance, it's what Ukraine faces, genocide, a kind of, not a sort of planned starvation genocide, but an actual genocide of killing everyone, destroying the buildings, wiping Ukrainian identity off the map. So that, when I look at Russian propaganda about Ukraine, it looks a lot like Nazi propaganda about Jews. And so for me, that struck a chord. Like, the Nazis actually thought of Ukrainians as natural slaves. They didn't think of them as they thought of Jews. They thought of Ukrainians as laborers, as people they can put into slave labor, like under slavery, Black Americans were treated. But now the Russian fascism, treats Ukrainians like Nazis treated Jews. It says they're an existential threat to Russia. Nazis said there can be no living Jews because as long as there are living Jews, we Aryans are in danger. That's what the Russians are saying about Ukrainians. So it immediately set off alarm bells as a child of Holocaust survivors. I feel when there's a genocide that is threatened, I need to do what I can, whatever little I can, to warn about that. Both my parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother is from Chelm, and she survived in the Gulag before she was returned. She returned to Poland. My father is from Berlin, who was 7. He fled Berlin in 1939 when he was 7. And so they experienced genocide. All 6 of my great aunts and uncles and all of their children were shot over pits in eastern Poland by ordinary men. And we're seeing it again. I went to Babyn Yar yesterday, and under the urging of Ukrainian politicians and friends of mine said, you have to go. I grew up hearing about Babyn Yar. all Jews hear about Babyn Yar from a very young age. It's existential horror for us. 2 days, 33,000 people killed. It's existential horror because Ukraine means so much for Jews. It's one of our two homes. Poland and Ukraine are, where most Jews come from. And and it was an event that was so quick. And there was Ukrainian complicity because the Nazis, like the Russians today, always have collaborators in their country. So growing up, I had heard that Ukraine, the Soviet Union, its version of anti-Semitism was never to mention the Holocaust. So they'd have a memorial in Babyn Yar that doesn't mention Jews. And we had heard Ukraine that Babyn Yar was not something that was central in Ukraine. And that's kind of horrifying because it's a central site of the Holocaust. And to have Babyn Yar be memorialized like that is very moving and important. It was moving and important to me. So I felt if Ukraine can do that, I should do what I can to help Ukraine in facing something.
So you visited the site?
I visited the site.
And what are your impressions about the site and about the memorial?
I thought
what have you seen? Because most people actually might not have seen it or might not have.
It was remarkably well done. There's when you walk down the road that many Jews and Roma walked down before they were shot, there's loudspeakers that list the names, an endless repetition of the names of the people who were murdered. There's a large memorial on a field where there are columns with bullet holes using all the exact bullets that were used to murder people, murder so many.
So they actually got the bullets out of the ground.
Exactly. They got the bullets out of the ground and they shot them into the holes so you could see the wounds the shape of the wounds that must have been on people's bodies. And throughout, you're hearing this music that's created from the 100,000 names of people that they've found. So you realize that there's this enormous memory project of retrieving the names of these people. And then there was a very moving memorial to Bakhmut. First of all, they showed you what happened in Bakhmut during World War II, where they took 3,000 Jews and put them in a mine and walled up the mine, so they died over days. And all the Jews of Bakhmut. And then they show you Bakhmut today, and there's a film that shows you Bakhmut in World War II, Bakhmut done by the son of one of the Nazis, Bakhmut in World War II, Bakhmut in 2021, and then Bakhmut today, showing you that the few buildings the Nazis left standing, the Russians have destroyed.
Amazing.
Yeah. One thing I found in my research for my book, How Fascism Works, is that every fascist politician, because fascism always usually comes into power through democratic elections, they always run anti-corruption campaigns. So you have to be very careful. Putin ran an anti-corruption campaign in 2011.
China kills for corruption, presumably, right? Or there's capital punishment.
Well, but I'm making a different point. I'm making the point that you have to be a little careful of the desire you have to wipe out corruption, but you have to be very careful of leaders who say, I'm going to be the one who's going to wipe out corruption. Because look at Trump. Trump ran an anti-corruption campaign. Putin ran an anti-corruption campaign. These are incredibly corrupt politicians. But that said, what this means is in a democracy, the politicians have to be not corrupt. Because as soon as they're a little bit corrupt, a fascist leader can come and say they're corrupt, elect me. Look at Putin. Look at Lukashenko. Look at the Orban. Orban's children are his family is massively wealthy. What I found in my research is that the most corrupt politicians always accuse other people of corruption. As I said, Putin, Trump, both always run anti-corruption campaigns. The Republicans today are saying Joe Biden is corrupt, so we need Donald Trump. Putin is the most corrupt politician of the 21st century. He's accusing Ukraine of being corrupt, really? So he's the most fascist politician since World War II. He's accusing Ukraine of being fascist, really? So this charge of corruption, however, has incredible power politically. This is one thing I've noticed in my research. Every time you have an incredibly corrupt politician, every time you have a fascist politician, they accuse the democracy of being corrupt. Because a democracy is a mess. It involves a lot of people having to answer a lot of different interests. And so it looks corrupt. It looks, I have to make you happy and make you happy. So it's not
some rents going this way, some distortions in regulatory framework, some polls, some decisions.
Exactly, because you've got to win.
You're
balancing them out. Whereas an autocratic leader just says, this is how it's going to be. And so that seems not corrupt. So corruption, democracies are always accused of corruption by would-be autocratic leaders who then want to come and say, see, it's not corrupt. It's just what I say. When a poor journalist can write an article about a politician showing that he's lying, that politician is lying, and that politician loses power because of it. Because that's a culture of...
If a politician is lying, a poor, unknown,
they become unpopular.
Yeah, so they become unpopular, and the consequences, they lose office for lying, not for actions, but just for lying.
Yes, because that's what political equality is. They're caught lying, or they're caught being corrupt, lying for money, and that means they lose power, because that's speaking truth to power. That's a culture of accountability, a culture of truth. And so what you need in a democracy is a culture of accountability. And so otherwise you can't hold your politicians to account. So that's why powerful people try to erase a culture of accountability. They try to make it so that if you're caught lying, it doesn't matter. Everyone's like, you got away with it. That's great. So
smart guy.
Smart guy, exactly. And then there's only power. The United States is very corrupt. I mean, Trump, is always, he bought a hotel in Washington and everybody stayed in it, thereby contributing to Trump when he was president. I mean, and that's just one of a billion examples of what Trump did. So, but the United States is generally just corrupt. The thing is, politicians have to realize that when they're caught being corrupt, trying to enrich themselves, it threatens democracy. It's a threat to democracy.
So if we see a local hromada and a bunch of Bentleys parked in front of the council, these guys have to be voted out.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Vote them out. and we should, it's healthy to have that attitude. Colonization, and this is the way M.A. Césaire presents it, colonization corrupts a nation's soul. Because when you colonize another country, you're fascist to them. You impose fascism on them. And now you can be like Belgium. Belgium, King Leopold II killed 10 million Congolese. And they cut off the hands of little children. There's all these pictures of little 5-year-olds with their missing hands. They all to get rubber. They would cut off the hands of children in a tribe if the tribe didn't bring them enough rubber. And so 10 million. And the Belgians aren't fascist, but Belgian wealth is based on one of history's worst crimes. So they imposed a kind of Auschwitz on Congolese, kind of mixture of Auschwitz and the Gulag, because it was about labor. And so colonialism involves treating a population in a fascist way. But you can still preserve your own non-fascist regime. But what M.A. Césaire says is that very often those fascist practices will come home to you.
I think we have been colonized, so we have to be decolonized, and therefore we have to learn Ukrainian and we have to speak Ukrainian. Okay.
It's nevertheless important to preserve Ukrainian and to teach speak Ukrainian in schools and in public places. Making sure that people read Shevchenko and other Ukrainian writers and preserve the Ukrainian language as the official language. You know, think of the feeling that Ukrainians have when they hear Putin. They think very negatively. Or Russia right now. They think negatively. Or, you know, or the Ukrainian independence. 1991, Ukrainian independence. They think positively. So those are values that are connected with language, with ways of speaking, ways of describing the world.
And you have a book forthcoming on the language.
The politics of language.
And it's forthcoming, I think, in Princeton.
The theory that I argue for with my co-author David Beaver in my book, which is, for me, a language reflects its history. And Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and so it has that history. And to erase that history would be to erase part of history. And so, you know, Russia wants to erase your history.
We shouldn't be helping them.
We shouldn't be helping them. Exactly. So by erasing Ukraine's time in the Soviet Union, you're erasing your own history and you're doing no favors to your children and grandchildren.
How do I decolonize myself? We have been colonized. We are speaking Russian. So what?
Why should we help the colonizers? Why should we enrich their language? So if you're forced to speak Russian and you use the word worship, it doesn't have the same resonance. And so losing your language is losing your history. When you're asked to speak someone else's language, it's someone else's set of practices, someone else's experiences, someone else's history. Now you can change that history. You can work in that language to change the meanings and try to make it your own.
How do I decolonize myself while transiting, while moving forward?
Ukraine and what Ukraine has been affected by that time. So if you try to remove that time, you're actually removing Ukrainian history. It is part of Ukrainian history to have been part of the Soviet Union. To go back to your earlier point about collective responsibility, many Ukrainians were proud Soviet citizens.
Yes.
Ukrainians helped defeat the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so.
But also helped to do Gulag, and were one of the most largest, you know, or at least very well represented part of people in Gulag.
Yeah, I think
both,
Ukrainians,
both sides, right?
Sides. That's right. That's right. And Ukrainians helped the Nazis. Some Ukrainians.
That's true.
You know, so there's all of our.
Even now we have Ukrainians who are willingly given coordinates of schools and hospitals to Russians.
Right. Exactly. That's common in colonial situations, where members of a colonized population are taken over, are collaborators, and they're usually the worst. When you sell out your own people and work for the colonizer, it has a terrible effect on you. So we know that from history.
Some people are saying, you know, this is just the Kremlin or Putin, but there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people actively involved in executing the strategy of the Kremlin today, in killing these people. Someone is pressing a button in a tank, shooting at a civilian building. Yeah. Someone is shooting a machine gun at a car trying to evacuate.
Yeah, so the 20th century and now the 21st century has been brutal for this, right? We've seen so many genocides, and we're seeing one again here. So, you know, there's Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, about the Wehrmacht. You know, Himmler thought that Germans would never be able to do it.
And now the alarm is going up, the siren, the missile alert is going up.
Right. Missile alert, again and again, the missiles, you know.
It was straight away to everything, to including corruption and humanity and Babi Yar and memory. But so we'll continue and say if it gets closer, we'll be pushed into this shelter, you know. Yeah. So they're gonna monitor the channels and see.
Yeah, I've been teaching in the shelter several times.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, it's just announcement of the. Okay.
Yeah.